Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping into a stack of your sources that really get into some sensitive stuff.
Yeah, it looks like we're covering investigations, alleged surveillance involving figures like Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump.
Exactly. We're looking at FBI statements, testimony, news reports, expert commentary. Quite a mix you've provided.
That's right. And these sources, together, they sort of weave a specific narrative about these events.
So our mission, as always, is to walk through this material with you, pull out the key points these sources make, and just understand what they are saying.
Yep. No taking sides, just laying out what's presented here in the documents.
It's definitely complex terrain, lots of legal points and political context.
For sure. We're focusing solely on the story told by these specific sources.
Okay, let's dive in. First up, the Clinton email investigation. How did these sources summarize the initial FBI findings?
Well, based on this material, the FBI found 110 emails containing classified information.
110, okay.
Yeah, spread across 52 separate email chains, and the sources break it down further.
How so?
They note 8 chains had top secret info, 36 were secret, and others contained confidential information.
And all this was found where, exactly?
On an unclassified system, specifically, according to the sources, located on a server in her home basement.
Wow. And the sources stress that this is an unauthorized location for classified material, right?
Absolutely. The material is very clear on that point. Unauthorized.
So classified info, unauthorized system, yet the sources state the FBI recommended no prosecution. That seems to be a major point of focus in this material.
It is. The justification provided, according to these sources, was that the judgment call was that no reasonable prosecutor would actually bring the case.
No reasonable prosecutor. Why not, based on the sources?
The sources explained the FBI felt they couldn't prove criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt. Specifically, they mentioned needing proof of a, quote, general awareness of the unlawfulness of your conduct.
So proving she knew it was unlawful was the hurdle.
That's the argument presented in the sources, yeah, that the evidence didn't cross that threshold for them.
But then the sources seem to pivot and highlight things that could suggest intent, or at least consciousness of guilt.
Right, they definitely build that counter-argument. The sources bring up, for instance, evidence suggesting an intent to cover things up.
Like what?
Specifically, they mentioned the wiping of servers using a tool called BleachBit.
BleachBit, okay.
And the argument made in these sources is that taking steps like concealing or destroying data, that's considered best evidence that someone knew their conduct was wrong. It points towards consciousness of guilt, as they put it.
The sources also seem to hammer on contradictions between her public statements and what the FBI found.
Yes, that's a huge part of how they build the case for intent in the material. They list several statements made by Clinton.
Publicly or in testimony?
Both, it seems. And they contrast these directly with the FBI's findings, explicitly labeling several of her claims as not true.
Can you give us some examples from the sources?
Sure. The sources state she said she never sent or received any classified info on private email. The FBI found she did. That's labeled not true.
Okay. What else?
She reportedly said nothing was marked classified. The FBI found a few documents with portion markings. Not true. She said she used just one device. The FBI found multiple. Not true.
Seems like a pattern according to these sources.
They present it that way. Also, she said all work emails were returned to state. The FBI found thousands weren't. Not true. And that her lawyers read every email individually. The FBI found they didn't.
And the sources then tie these alleged false statements back to legal ideas.
Exactly. That's crucial to their argument. They explicitly connect these statements, which they characterize as false, to the legal concept of false exculpatory statements.
Meaning?
Meaning, basically, lies told to get yourself off the hook. The sources argue these are used as evidence of criminal intent, showing that consciousness of guilt.
So the idea is, if you lie about it, you knew it was wrong.
That's the implication drawn in the source material. They argue that what they describe as a complex scheme for concealment plus the destruction of records.
Like the BleachBit thing.
Right. All that would be presented as evidence of intent in a potential prosecution.
Oh.
They also suggest the scale of it, how long it went on, the sheer number of emails. That would also point towards intent.
Looking at all this, the sources definitely seem to raise questions about fairness, about consequences.
They do. They explicitly introduce this idea of a perceived double-track justice system.
How do they illustrate that?
They use a hypothetical comparison. Imagine someone with the same fact pattern, extremely careless with classified info, potential exposure to hostile actors, multiple devices, not returning emails.
Yeah.
If that person applied for, say, an FBI security clearance, the sources argue this conduct would be a very important consideration.
Implying they wouldn't get it.
Yeah.
Or would be fired.
That's the strong implication, yes. That they'd likely be denied clearance, or if already employed, could face termination, suspension, loss of clearance, serious consequences.
So the contrast the sources draw is?
It's between that hypothetical and the reality presented. They point out, a private in the Army might get kicked out for something similar, but Hillary Clinton, running for president, wasn't prosecuted.
And the sources express concern about precedent.
Yeah, they voice a fear that this outcome means there's still effectively no precedent for criminal charges in these kinds of cases, at least based on this specific instance.
Okay, that really lays out the perspective presented in the sources on the Clinton email situation. Now, the material seems to use that as a springboard.
Right, it pivots.
To raise questions about other investigations, specifically claims involving Donald Trump and alleged surveillance.
Exactly. The sources shift focus to allegations about surveillance targeting Trump and the Trump Organization, supposedly by the Obama administration.
What specific points do they bring up?
They mention CNN reports from back then about Russian efforts to compromise Trump, and also an FBI probe into a computer link between a Russian bank and the Trump org.
And FISA warrants. Do the sources mention those?
Yes, they do. The material states that FISA warrants were reportedly issued.
FISA being for foreign intelligence surveillance.
Correct. According to these sources, one warrant was related to the broader Russia hacking investigation, and, interestingly, a separate one specifically targeted the server registered to Trump Tower.
And the source for that claim about the Trump Tower server?
The material cites a source claiming to be 100% sure about that specific warrant.
Okay. The sources also reference a New York Times article.
They do. It's an article titled, "Secret Court Says FBI Aides Misled Judges in 75 Cases."
And how do the sources use that article?
They interpret it as evidence of a pattern. The argument presented is that it shows the FBI might have a track record of, misleading the FISA court to get surveillance approved.
This all leads up to a pretty explosive claim presented in the sources, doesn't it? About surveillance potentially happening outside the usual U.S. channels.
Yes, that's definitely one of the most striking claims. It comes, according to the sources, via Fox News commentary, citing 3 unnamed intelligence sources.
And the claim is?
The allegation presented is that President Obama bypassed the normal chain of command, NSA, CIA, FBI, DOJ.
Bypass them how? Who did he allegedly use instead?
The claim is that he used GCHQ.
The British Intelligence Agency.
That's right, GCHQ. The sources note they have, constant access to the NSA database.
And how is this supposedly done, according to this claim?
The allegation described is that 2 individuals went to GCHQ to get transcripts of conversations involving Trump, both as a candidate and president-elect.
And the stated reason for using the British agency.
The sources claim the rationale was no American fingerprints to keep it off the U.S. books, essentially.
Wow. That's quite an allegation presented there.
It is. The sources also add a detail that the head of GCHQ resigned around that time, though they don't explicitly link the resignation to this alleged activity.
Now, the sources seem convinced there was a political motivation behind all this alleged surveillance.
Yeah.
How do they connect those dots?
They explicitly link it back to their interpretation of the Clinton investigation. They argue that figures like Comey, appointed by Obama and perceived by these sources as having, let's say, managed the Clinton case outcome for political reasons, would therefore, in their view, be willing to engage in investigating or surveilling Trump for partisan gain. Specifically, the sources claim to help Hillary Clinton, who Obama had endorsed.
The language the sources use to describe this is very strong.
Extremely strong. The material characterizes the alleged surveillance as Soviet-level wrongdoing.
Soviet-level?
Yes, and an order of magnitude worse than Watergate. The core argument is that this represents using the state's power, its intelligence apparatus, against a political opponent during an election.
That's a very serious charge they're reporting.
Absolutely. They also point to a New York Times article from January 19th, right before Trump's inauguration, that mentioned intelligence reports based on wiretapped communications had been given to the Obama White House.
And the sources suggest this could be how leaks happened.
That's the insinuation, yes, that this sharing of wiretap info with the White House could be the origin.
What about an official cover? Do the sources speculate on how such surveillance might have been justified on paper?
They suggest the likely cover story would involve international contacts which relate to business transactions.
Kind of a standard reason for foreign intelligence interest.
Right, but the sources immediately contrast this by noting that the Clinton Foundation was known to be taking foreign money, drawing a comparison there.
Okay, so let's pull these two threads together. How exactly does the source material link its narrative about the Clinton email investigation to these claims about alleged Trump surveillance?
Essentially, the sources use their analysis of the Clinton case, particularly the non-prosecution decision and the role attributed to figures like Comey as evidence or context.
Context for what?
Context suggesting that political motives could influence actions within the Justice Department and intelligence agencies. They then apply that lens to the Trump situation, arguing that the same political dynamics could lead to improper surveillance for partisan advantage.
So the core concern running through all this material is?
It seems to be twofold. The potential misuse of law enforcement and intelligence powers for political purposes, and the perception of an unequal application of justice based on political standing or connections.
We've certainly covered a lot of ground based on the sources you shared. We looked at the FBI's findings in the Clinton email case versus the decision not to prosecute, the whole debate presented in the sources around intent and those not true statements.
Right, and the perception of a double standard they highlight.
And then we shifted to the really serious allegations presented concerning surveillance of Donald Trump, the FISA warrants, the claims about misleading the court.
And that very controversial claim involving GCHQ, the British agency, allegedly being used to avoid American fingerprints.
It's crucial for everyone listening to remember this entire discussion, everything we've laid out,
Is based strictly solely on the information, the claims, and the arguments found within the specific source material provided for this deep dive. We're just relaying their perspective.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up, maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over, drawn from the themes in these sources. Given the information and the very serious allegations presented in this material concerning classified information handling on one side and the potential use of state power and surveillance in politics on the other, how do you personally evaluate the information you receive from powerful institutions and actors, and where do you place your trust? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We really appreciate you sharing these sources and digging into them with us.